Donald Trump has been elected the 45th President of the United States.
The most remarkable political night in
This is the people rising up saying it's time to listen to us.
It's time for us to come together as one united people.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert. You're at The Listening Post. This week, we're taking an extended look at the news coverage of the U.S. presidential election, starting with the on-again, off-again, love-hate relationship that Donald Trump had with the American news media. There was far too much reporting on the polls, even if those polls turned out to be accurate, which they did not. How will the news media now deal with a president who calls them corrupt? And we dig deep into the history, the way the U.S. corporate media were built, the regulations that went away, and the legislation that paved the way for the creation of some of the biggest media companies the world has ever seen. They were the headlines the American news media never really expected to publish, broadcast, or tweet, which makes a certain kind of sense, because Donald Trump's election victory was the last chapter in a story that those covering had failed to really comprehend. On election night, Americans learned that all those opinion polls were wrong. The pundits who had pored over the polls had missed the point, and the distance between the Washington press corps and the people they were reporting to had opened up into a political abyss. The Trump campaign and its relationship with the U.S. news media is really a story of two parts. Stage one was during the primaries, and the networks could not get enough of the candidate and the ratings that he attracted. Stage two came after he won the Republican nomination. Journalists looked more closely, critically at Trump, and he attacked the media, branding them as a corrupt component of the very establishment that he was out to defeat. Now American journalists are looking at 4 years of a president who effectively campaigned against them, turned Americans against them, and who has pledged to loosen libel laws to rein in critical journalism just when news organizations can least afford it. Our starting point this week is the city that produced the candidate, also known as the media capital of the world, New York City. In a country that found itself split down the middle once again, another election that was a 50-50 proposition, the losing side was never going to take it well. The subsequent demonstrations in multiple cities were testament to that. Many Americans are casting blame at the parties, the system, and the media. The two big names on the ballot were the two least popular nominees in the history of U.S. presidential politics. So relatively speaking, Americans hated the players. They might be better off hating the game.
Trump played two games. One, he fed the media's fascination with him and gave lots and lots of access to the media during the primaries and during the general election, more so than Hillary Clinton did.
It was a mutual manipulation. He was feeding the media free headlines or 3 or 4 or 5 sound bites a day non-stop.
We're going to get rid of all of the bad ones. We got gang members, we have killers, we have a lot of bad people. I have one of the great temperaments. I have a winning temperament.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
You're the nominee.
I told you.
And it was great for him because he didn't have to pay a single dollar for all that. And for the networks and cable in the US especially, was a manna from heaven. They had a headline story virtually every day for like 18 months.
But he mostly did it through social media. When he tweeted at 3 o'clock in the morning, at 4 o'clock in the morning, cable channels, talk radio channels, stations picked up that tweet.
Trump tweeting, "Mexico will pay for the wall."
And he became the jet propulsion for the debate. He set the terms of the debate.
In the end, he turned the tables on the whole thing.
I find the press to be extremely dishonest.
He started to project his supporters and a lot of American public opinion against media as part of this huge conglomerate.
I'm running against the crooked media.
He demonized us. He made us part of the establishment that he was running against. So on one hand, he soaked up media attention, which helped him, but he soaked it up in order to get out a message of killing the messenger. And it was a wonderful irony of sorts that he was able to play both sides this way.
Because we have a problem in this country.
During the primary phase, when accused of covering Trump for reasons that were more commercial than editorial, news executives like Jeff Zucker, who runs CNN, argued modestly that the influence of their networks had been greatly exaggerated. CBS's chairman, Leslie Moonves, was far more candid in that he flat out said what his counterparts at other networks may well have been thinking, but keeping to themselves.
It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. The money's rolling in, and, this is going to be a very good year for us. It's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. Go ahead. Keep going.
It's one of those rare glimpses I think we were able to get into how the sausage is being made in the media when Les kind of opened up and talked about the benefits this had to ratings. Trump earned his coverage by delivering audience to the networks. They knew they can bank on him, and he delivered.
There is no question that the media profited from the rise of Donald Trump. The question for the media now becomes, does Donald Trump's election mean a loss of interest that he built up when he gets to the rather mundane and sometimes boring job of governing? And there is an expectation that our ratings, that our traffic is going to fall, and is going to fall fairly substantially from the peaks that we reached during the campaign.
This race now tighter than it's ever been before.
Apart from overdosing on Donald Trump, the other hallmark of the campaign coverage was the media's obsession with opinion polls. Studies of U.S. media output have found that in some presidential campaigns, reporting on polls, dissecting and analyzing them, sometimes comprises more than half of all election coverage, often at the expense of more substantive coverage, such as what the candidates actually stand for.
She's up 8 points in the latest ABC News Washington Post poll.
Clinton with a double-digit lead over
Secretary Clinton at 49% among likely voters in our new poll.
Which would be hard enough for news organizations to defend if the polls they obsess over were accurate.
It shows Mrs. Clinton with a 4-point lead in a two-way race.
But more and more of them are not, and they were proven wrong again on election night.
But I think polls were slammed in the 2012 election and in the 2008 election, and this one might be a little bit of an extra nail in the coffin on polls going forward, but there's going to have to be some substitute scorekeeper going forward. People want to know how far somebody's in the lead and how far somebody's behind, and to a certain extent, polling does fill that role.
The first thing media have to do with respect to the polls is pay a lot less attention to them. They should be a tool, not a crutch. News organizations, media need to go out and listen to people. Don't just talk about the polls around a table with a bunch of anchors and a bunch of commentators. There is another world out there, and when the media, like the political elite, lose touch with people in farther flung parts of the country who have lost out because of globalization, who are falling behind because income inequality has raced ahead, they need to reconnect.
Trump now trying to strike a different tone.
We will treat everyone with dignity.
Having been played by Donald Trump during the primaries and then dumped like a jilted lover as Election Day approached, the U.S. news media have reason to be red-faced.
It just came out of nowhere. Nobody expected. Pennsylvania.
As for what lies ahead, with Trump threatening to make it easier for Americans to sue journalists for libel, the U.S. media are bracing themselves for Phase 3 in their quite complicated relationship with their new president-elect.
It's definitely a wake-up call to the media. I might be an idealist, but I believe even with a candidate like Trump, so long as we have the First Amendment to defend journalists and free speech in this country, the ability to question something that somebody says in the executive branch, no matter how powerful they are, no matter how much control they wield, is still a bedrock of this country. I think how that's wielded going forward is going to be a challenge.
The relationship between the Trump presidency and corporate media is going to be absolute hell, because now maybe they're starting their self-examination and find out how they were played all along, how they will be played later on, because Trump can bypass media completely and talk directly to American voters and the American people, and he proved that already. He doesn't need special reports, or he doesn't need cable TV for that.
As voting day approached, anyone with a social media feed would have noticed that more and more Americans were accusing their news media, especially broadcasters, of not just reporting on the race for the White House, but actually affecting the outcome. So how did America find itself in a place where so many voters, and not just a few voices here and there, were blaming their news media for the rise of Donald Trump, a candidate many Republicans, let alone Democrats, considered to be dangerous. Were those networks ideologically driven? In most cases, they were not. They did have agendas, though, commercial ones, that prioritized ratings and revenues over journalism and responsible reporting. Measuring all of the media coverage over the entire presidential campaign, the content, tone, and ideology is near impossible. There's just too much of it. But what we can do, with the help of some American media analysts, is examine some of the structural issues in the U.S. broadcasting landscape. Simply put, the American airwaves are like no other, and they weren't always like this. First of all, U.S. broadcasters no longer have a regulatory requirement for balance, and haven't had one since the late 1980s. That change was followed by a certain piece of legislation passed in the 1990s, the Telecommunications Act, which helped turn dozens of media companies into a very few mega media conglomerates. Combine that with the fact that the U.S. is also the only major country without a significant state-funded broadcaster, relying almost entirely on private corporations for broadcast journalism, and you start to see the bigger picture. The Listening Post's Flo Phillips now on how the American broadcasting landscape was shaped and came to be what it is today.
I called a lawyer in Miami. I know he said four of the guys that were arrested were from
It was 1976, and the U.S. media had never been more popular.
Hi, this is Carl Bernstein, the Washington Post, and I was
Celebrated by Hollywood over Watergate, the story of two Washington Post reporters who took down a president over abuse of power. For more than 40 years, Gallup has polled Americans on whether they trust the media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly. That same year, 1976, 72% of respondents said yes, the highest figure Gallup recorded. Today, just 32% of Americans say they trust the media. So what has changed? You could say it's a tale of two presidents, Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. Ever heard of the Fairness Doctrine? It was a regulation that forced American broadcasters to give both sides of the news story.
The Fairness Doctrine was implemented in the 1940s by the Federal Communications Commission, and it basically said that broadcast licensees, radio and television stations, should do two things. They should give ample coverage to public affairs and issues of importance in their community. And secondly, they said, when they do that, they should not present just one side of the story. They should be fair. They should allow different positions to exist. That was the idea of the Fairness Doctrine.
The thinking behind that doctrine was along the very same lines as what broadcast regulators were doing the world over. Where differing and reasonable views existed, those views should be reflected in broadcast journalism. The Fairness Doctrine was the regulatory law of the land in the United States for almost 4 decades, until 1987, when the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, dispensed with it, under the guiding hand of a Republican president, Ronald Reagan. Patricia Diaz-Dennis was a commissioner at the FCC when the final vote on the constitutionality of the Fairness Doctrine was held.
The justification for us ending the application of the so-called Fairness Doctrine was that it violated the First Amendment rights of the broadcasters. The First Amendment is one of our strongest and most important guarantees to our democracy. Congress shall pass no law that abridges freedom of speech or of the press. And by the time we looked at this issue, there were so many more radio and television stations available to everyone. Cable had proliferated, direct broadcast satellite was coming into its own, and ever more increasing outlets for people to go for news and information. So the proliferation of channels led to the abolition of the Fairness Doctrine.
It's important to remember that the FCC Commissioner Mark Fowler described television as a toaster with pictures.
What we like to say is instead of attempting to deregulate, we want to unregulate.
Eliminating the Fairness Doctrine was about saying there's nothing special about media. We don't need to regulate it in any particular way at all. But the principles that it represented, that those who control them have tremendous responsibilities, and that those responsibilities are primarily to the public.
3 out of 4 Americans believe the news media is biased.
Getting rid of the Fairness Doctrine is, what opened the way to Fox News, to some extent later MSNBC, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, many conservative talkers who deliver up these hot-blooded opinions.
What's going on here, Colonel? I'm not a military expert, but this sounds like one of the most ill-conceived military missions I've ever heard of.
And that's become a major theme in at least cable broadcast and talk radio journalism.
He basically is. It's like
In short, less talking, more shouting, and a lot of ranting.
Stop. Hey, can you turn her microphone off, please?
The second deregulatory step the US took was the passing of the Telecommunications Act under a Democratic president, Bill Clinton. The new law brought an end to cross-ownership restrictions, which the FCC had put in place in 1975 and had prevented the same proprietor from owning more than one media outlet in the same market.
This had to do with issues of cross-ownership, whether one corporation could own a television station, a radio outlet, and a newspaper in a town. But when you have that kind of media monopoly, it's very frightening. Information will flow or be stopped according to who the media owner is.
The Telecommunications Act that allowed all those major media corporations to swallow up all of their competition and become clear, obvious oligopolies. Well, that's a disaster. That we can't have. But the problem was those same corporations were the ones funding the politicians. So the politicians said, oh, golly gee, I think you're right. I think it'd be lovely to have oligopolies. Buy away.
A little more than 30 years ago, in 1983, 90% of the US media was controlled by 50 companies. By 2010, a half dozen companies, the so-called Big Six, had control of 96% of what Americans watch. The Telecommunications Act made that possible, and the Big Six mega media conglomerates that were created in its wake have, wittingly or unwittingly, played a central role in the ascent of Donald Trump.
I humbly and gratefully accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
For all the ideological differences between Fox on the right, MSNBC on the left, and all the channels in between, they have one thing in common: loyalty to their corporate shareholders, which means that ratings that Trump delivered are everything. And the numbers back that up. The Tindall Report is a media monitoring site that does the maths. It added up the network news coverage on CBS, NBC, and ABC for the early primaries in 2015. 1/3 of it was spent on Donald Trump, swamping his Republican rivals, and more airtime than the entire Democratic field combined. The 24-hour news channels were every bit as addicted to the candidate.
Thank you for sitting down with me.
And not just Fox News. CNN and MSNBC also gorged themselves on Trump coverage.
You're very successful, there's no question.
Their bias had more to do with ratings than a shared ideology with the candidate.
Thank you, Trump. Thanks for coming over. Coming up.
And here is some more recent maths. MediaQuant is an American analytics firm that measures the value of news coverage, which is free versus advertising that must be paid for. And their number crunchers say that all the extra airtime that Donald Trump received during the first 9 months of this year has been worth more than $4.1 billion. Again, no other candidate, not even Hillary Clinton, came close.
The main problem with corporate media seeing the audience really as consumers and not as citizens is that they don't start from people's concerns. One example of that, we had two real outsider candidacies at one point, Donald Trump on the Republican side and Bernie Sanders. ABC News in the first 11 months of last year devoted 81 minutes of coverage to Donald Trump.
Donald Trump is here right now.
Donald Trump and what he said today about
Donald Trump front and center.
Donald Trump on the attack.
Donald Trump under fire again. And 20 seconds to Bernie Sanders. That's a news network making a decision.
The corporate media is the establishment, and that's why we have the kind of media we do in America. So, for example, Hillary Clinton is far more pleasant to corporate interests. She's amiable to their boards. She is keen to serve them as she has in the past. So that is why Time Warner and Comcast are among her top 10 donors.
Are your competitive juices flowing for the chance to be the first female president?
So the media has played a central role in both sides, both parties, for the worse in each case. And in both cases, in the first case because of their political biases towards mainstream, in the second case because of their immense commercial biases to make money as much as possible.
The seeds of corporate hegemony in the US media sector were planted in the late 1920s.
A new sort of gadget began to cut into reading time. It had been known as the wireless, but it gradually changed its name to radio.
The Paley family of Philadelphia bought a small network of 16 local radio stations and turned it into CBS Radio. A few years later, Congress went to work on a communications law to govern the new medium. 2 senators tried to amend the law to reserve 25% of the radio airwaves for non-profit and educational purposes. However, the private broadcasters lobbied against that, and they won the day. The Communications Act that passed in 1934 left no room for public broadcasting. So while other countries were building publicly funded broadcasters such as Britain's BBC, Canada's CBC, Japan's NHK, the American government would surrender the airwaves almost entirely to private interests. In 1967, Congress did pass the Public Broadcasting Act, which created NPR on radio and PBS television.
Tonight is what you make it, so make it good.
But the way that law was written, PBS and NPR had severely restricted mandates and funding. So Americans who thought that their new public channels could actually compete with their privately owned rivals were in for a disappointment. And as for those who say, praise be to the internet, it's there to set us free from these corporate voices, it's not that cut and dried. News sites like BuzzFeed, Vice, and Vox, all aimed at millennials, are not immune from the influence of the Big Six either. 21st Century Fox, Disney, and Comcast, through NBC Universal, have invested hundreds of millions of dollars into them.
These days, the same corporations who own radio, television, and newspapers are owning large swaths of the internet, which is why we have to fight to keep the internet open and free. It was built with public funds, and now corporations would like to privatize it because, of course, it is so incredibly lucrative for them. But we can't let that happen.
History suggests that Americans will let that happen. Ever since the early days of US media, that has been the prevailing ethos. In corporations we trust, and that the best kind of regulations are the ones that aren't there.
No industry likes to be regulated, and journalism is no different from any other industry. I was dean of Columbia Journalism School for 10 years, and on every occasion I could find, I would say there should be more regulated broadcasting in the United States. I never found literally a single person who agreed with me. Journalists are really trained to think government regulation is okay, except when it applies to journalism, in which case it's absolute moral wrong. So if that's what you believe, this is the world you get.
I will be president for all Americans.
The world now faces 4 years of a Donald Trump presidency. And here's the thing to remember. The US broadcast media, which are almost 100% corporate, will always remain loyal to their ratings and their shareholders, not the public. Because the bottom line is, it's America. And as Walter Cronkite used to say on CBS News,
and that's the way it is.
The ascendance of Donald Trump has served as a jolt to the American establishment, not just the 2 main political parties, but also the American news media. Both the Democrats and the Republicans will inevitably go through some serious changes. However, the news media could also use a makeover, both regulatory and structural, but there is no sign of that happening. And over the next 4 years, prepare for more stories about those in power in Washington, those trying to take power back, and the dysfunctional relationship that both sides have with the American Fourth Estate. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.